Every opportunity that I give those stewards, he says, every single time they give me a penalty. Nobody answers him on the radio. 4 sanctions, 3 race weekends. And the man sitting next to him at Ferrari isn't disagreeing. That's the part that changes what this story actually is. It would be easy to write this off as a driver complaining about decisions that didn't go his way. Drivers do that every week. What makes Budapest different is that Fred Vasseur, the man who runs the team, the man who has every reason to stay diplomatic and let this blow over quietly, chose instead to back him up in public. Not about every single call, about the pattern. Here's the count laid out with no adjective attached to it. Silverstone, early July, a false start. 5 seconds. Ferrari's own sensor data reads no movement at all off the line. The team calls the decision harsh. 2 weeks later at Spa, first lap contact with George Russell. 5 seconds again, reduced from the standard 10 because it's cold tires on lap 1. The driver on the receiving end of that contact, George Russell himself, calls it a racing incident afterward. Not a penalty in his mind, not malice, just 2 cars finding the same piece of track. Then Hungary happens twice in one weekend. A 3-place grid drop in qualifying for blocking Oscar Piastri, a call the team itself later admits arrived too late to matter, and a 5-second penalty in the race for exceeding the pit lane limit by 1/10 of a kilometer per hour. 4 sanctions. 2 of them tied to margins so small they're barely measurable. One of them called a non-issue by the driver it happened to. And the 4th, Ferrari has already told you on the record, was their own mistake. Subscribe right now if you want the version of this story the highlight reels leave out, and tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. Because how familiar this pattern looks to you probably depends on how long you've been watching this driver specifically. So let's actually take these 4 apart, one at a time, the way a steward would have to. Was Hamilton moving before the lights went out at Silverstone? The team's telemetry says no. Was the Spa contact something Hamilton caused deliberately? Russell, the man who was hit, says no, it was simply racing. Did Hamilton know Piastri was behind him in Hungary qualifying at the moment it mattered? By his own account and Vasseur's confirmation, the information reached him only once the McLaren was already committed to its lap. And was 80.1 kilometers per hour meaningfully faster than 80? Only on a piece of paper that doesn't measure intent, danger, or anything a human being can actually feel through a steering wheel. 4 questions. 4 answers that all point the same direction. Not one of these is a case of a driver doing something reckless. Every one of them is a case of a system measuring something extremely small, extremely precisely, and applying a fixed price to it regardless of what actually happened on track. Keep that distinction in mind, because it's the whole argument, and it comes back at the end. There's a rule worth naming here because most coverage skips straight past it. Formula One's current stewarding panel rotates race by race, including a driver steward drawn from a pool of former competitors. In Budapest, that seat was filled by one name. Across the season, it rotates through several others. That's not an accusation against any individual sitting in that chair. It's the structural reason George Russell, as president of the Grand Prix Drivers Association, has spent this entire season publicly pushing for permanent, professional stewards instead of a panel that changes every fortnight. His argument isn't that anyone in that room is dishonest. It's that a panel which changes personnel every race cannot reliably produce identical judgments on identical incidents. And once you accept that premise, the 4 penalties in 3 weekends stop looking like one driver's bad luck and start looking like the predictable output of a system with no fixed reference point. Now here's where this gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the fairest version of this story requires you to look at the one weekend where the standard actually cut the other way. At Silverstone, that same afternoon, a second investigation opened against Hamilton over a yellow flag infringement. That one went his way. The stewards issued a reprimand and nothing more, and the podium survived. One of the 4 calls that weekend landed in his favor. Nobody clipped that one. Nobody built a thumbnail around it. That matters because it means the story isn't that every marginal call goes against him. It's that the margins have gotten so thin across the board that both outcomes, favorable and unfavorable, now hinge on readings no driver can feel in real time. Do the actual math on what these 4 penalties cost, because the number is not small. 5 points, roughly, from the Hungary finishing position swap alone, the difference between 4th and 5th. Add the grid drop that put him out of position to fight for the podium in the first place. Hamilton sits 50 points behind the championship lead heading into the summer break. 50 points across 9 remaining rounds is not an impossible gap to close. He's closed bigger ones before, in previous seasons in the second half of a campaign, but every point that disappears to a communication error or a decimal point reading is a point he now has to find twice. Once from raw pace, and once to make up for the ground a sensor took away from him. If you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of storyline you'll want to already be following, because the second half of this season is going to keep testing whether that gap is closable. Here's the choice Hamilton actually faces, and it's not a comfortable one. Does he keep pushing hard at the absolute limit of what these cars and these regulations allow, knowing that limit is being measured to a level of precision no human reflex can consistently hit? Or does he deliberately drive with more margin, giving up pace to protect against penalties that might not even materialize? There's no clean answer here. Push too hard and the next tenth of a kilometer per hour costs him again. Back off too much and Antonelli's 50-point lead only grows. Pick one, because those are genuinely the only two options available to him right now. And here's the honest counter-argument, because it deserves real airtime before anyone declares a verdict. Juan Pablo Montoya, watching the same Spa footage everyone else saw, called that specific penalty completely justified. No other current driver on the grid has publicly backed Hamilton's specific complaints about this run of decisions. The paddock is not lining up behind him the way it lined up behind Russell's push for permanent stewards. That's a defensible position, and it deserves to be said plainly. It is also not the position that survives 4 separate incidents, landing on the same car inside 3 weekends. 2 of them margins too small for any driver to have consciously controlled. Would these 4 penalties have existed at all if Formula One used a fixed panel of professional stewards instead of one that rotates? Nothing in the written reasoning behind any of these 4 decisions proves that outcome. It is not proven, and I'm not going to pretend it is. It is simply the question George Russell has been asking publicly all season. And it is a question anyone watching 4 sanctions land on one driver in 3 weekends is entitled to ask as well. Vasseur's decision to say any of this out loud in the first place is worth pausing on one more time, because it didn't have to happen. A team principal sitting on 50 points behind in a title fight had every reason to stay quiet, let the sanctions pass without comment, and avoid picking a public fight with the sport's own governing structure. He didn't do that. He backed his driver's read on at least one of these 4 calls, on the record, with his name attached to it. That's not the safe move. That's the move of someone who thinks the pattern is real enough to say so. Here's the verdict. 4 sanctions in 3 weekends is either the story of one driver having a genuinely unlucky run, or it's the story of a stewarding system so precise about tiny margins that consistency itself has become mathematically difficult to deliver. Both of those things can be true at once. What can't be true at once is the idea that this is simply a driver making mistakes, when the driver's own team, the people with the most to lose by saying so, are the ones telling you otherwise. Zandvoort is next, and then Monza, where Ferrari are reportedly bringing an upgraded engine specifically built to close the gap on the straights. None of that horsepower will matter if the same razor-thin margin claims another penalty before either car crosses the line. Whatever the drivers say to each other in the next briefing before a wheel turns in, Zandvoort will tell us whether this pattern gets acknowledged at the top or whether it just gets repeated. So tell me, is this a pattern or just coincidence? Vote below, and if you already knew the answer before I asked the question, hit like, because a lot of you called this exact inconsistency argument back when we covered George Russell's push for permanent stewards on this channel. Subscribe, because when the 5th penalty lands, and on this trend it will, I'm covering it the moment it does. Until the next one.